is Eleanor Hart. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described as dependable, steady, the kind of woman people trust with responsibility, but rarely check on emotionally. I've been a spouse, a professional, and the quiet center holding routines together, often without acknowledgement. From the outside, my life looked calm, even fortunate. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously broken. And that's exactly why it took so long for anyone, including me, to notice what was slowly disappearing. I've always been underestimated, but never loudly. Not in ways that spark arguments or raise alarms. It was more subtle than that. A pause before my opinion was taken seriously. Decisions were finalized before I was informed. Jokes were made at my expense, followed by a smile that suggested I was too sensitive if I noticed. I didn't fight those moments. I absorbed them. I told myself they didn't matter. People often mistake restraint for acceptance. I was calm, so they assumed I was fine. I didn't demand attention, so they assumed I didn't need consideration. I believed that consistency earned respect over time, that love, once established, didn't need to be proven again and again. I believed that being reasonable would eventually be reciprocated. This story is not about revenge. It isn't about confrontation or dramatic ultimatums or winning an argument in the end. It's about something quieter and far more common. It's about what happens when respect doesn't vanish all at once, but fades gradually, so gradually that you learn to live without it before you realize it's gone. For a long time, nothing in my marriage looked bad enough to leave. There were no raised voices, no obvious betrayals, no scenes you could point to and say, that's the moment everything broke. What there was instead was an ongoing absence of regard, being spoken over, being assumed, being relied on but not consulted, being present but not truly seen. I told myself this was adulthood. That partnership wasn't meant to feel affirming all the time. That asking for more respect was selfish. I stayed composed. I stayed logical. I stayed quiet because I believed maturity meant endurance. Until I understood that endurance, without mutual respect, is just slow self erasure. What you're about to hear is a first person account of how I stopped explaining myself, stopped negotiating my value, and eventually stopped offering respect where it was no longer returned. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. There are no villains in this story, no sudden twists driven by luck or cruelty, just consequences that unfold when one person continues to take and the other finally steps back. You'll hear about patience, restraint, preparation, and the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself until it's already irreversible. I'm sharing this because many people, especially women, are taught that being respected is something you earn by being agreeable long enough. And because far too many of us learn too late that respect is not something you should ever have to beg for. As you listen, pay attention to the small moments, the quiet ones, the ones that seem insignificant at first. Those are usually the moments where everything actually changes. Have you ever felt someone stop respecting you long before you stopped caring? For most of my marriage, I was described in ways that sounded flattering on the surface. Reliable, grounded, the responsible one. If someone asked who kept things running smoothly, My name came up quickly. Bills were paid on time. Appointments were remembered. Family obligations were handled quietly, without reminders. I was the person who noticed what needed to be done before it became urgent. What I wasn't described as was interesting, or influential, or essential in ways that went beyond function. To my spouse, I occupied a role that was clear but narrow. I was the one who could be counted on not to make things complicated, not to overreact, not to challenge decisions once they were already in motion. When people talked about us as a couple, it was often implied, never stated outright, that I was the stable background to his more visible presence. He had opinions, he had momentum, I had support. At first, I didn't resist that framing. I thought of it as a balance. I told myself every partnership needs someone steady, someone who absorbs friction so the whole structure doesn't shake. I believed that being calm was a contribution. Not needing reassurance was a strength. In social settings, I became almost transparent. Conversations would move around me instead of through me. Plans would be discussed as if my agreement was guaranteed. Sometimes, I'd realize a decision had been made that affected both of us, and I was hearing about it after the fact. Not maliciously, just casually, as if my consent was assumed by default. If I spoke up, it was usually with qualifiers. I might be wrong, but. Or it's not a big deal. I just wondered if I learned to soften my presence before it entered the room. And because I did it so well, people rarely noticed the effort behind it. My spouse trusted me with responsibility, but not with authority. I handled logistics, but I wasn't consulted on direction. I was dependable, but not deferential. When I disagreed, it was framed as unnecessary friction. When I went along, it was taken as confirmation that his way was the obvious one. None of this felt abusive. That's important to say. There were no insults, no shouting, no obvious contempt. Just a consistent pattern where my role was to adapt and his was to decide. Friends admired our lack of drama. Family commented on how easygoing I was. I received praise for my patience, my understanding, my ability to see both sides. What no one praised, and what I didn't yet know how to name, was how often I disappeared in order to maintain that image. Inside, I told myself stories to make it make sense. He's under a lot of pressure. This isn't personal. I'm just not as opinionated. I don't need to be at the center of everything. Those explanations worked until they didn't. Because over time, I noticed something subtle but persistent. My presence was only fully acknowledged when it was useful. When I solved a problem, smoothed a situation, or absorbed an inconvenience, I was appreciated. When I needed something, time, consideration, a pause before a decision, I was treated as an interruption. I didn't feel hated. I felt optional. And that's a difficult feeling to admit when you've built your identity around being needed, being the one others rely on without question, around being so steady that no one thinks to ask whether you're still standing comfortably or just standing still. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role was. I was the stabilizer, the buffer, the one who would make it work, no matter how it was handed to me. That role came with a kind of respect, but not the kind that sees you as an equal participant. more like a reliable structure that's only noticed when it fails. At the time, I didn't call it invisibility. I called it maturity. It would take much longer and much quieter moments for me to understand the cost of that misunderstanding. I can trace the first moment back now, even though at the time I barely registered it as important. That's how these things begin, not with an event dramatic enough to demand attention, but with something so small you feel almost embarrassed for noticing. We were standing in the kitchen, side by side, talking about an upcoming commitment, a decision that affected both of us. I remember offering a suggestion, nothing emotional, nothing confrontational, just a practical consideration, delivered calmly, the way I always spoke. He didn't argue with me. He didn't even disagree. He laughed, briefly, softly. Then he said, "You don't really understand how this works." It was said casually, almost kindly, as if he were correcting a minor error. And then the conversation moved on, just like that. I remember standing there a second longer than necessary, my hands still resting on the counter, feeling something tighten and then immediately loosen inside me. Not anger, not hurt, more like a quiet disorientation, as if I'd misheard or misunderstood the tone. Surely he didn't mean it that way. Surely it was just a poor choice of words. So I let it go. That was the pattern. Something would land slightly wrong, and I would be the first person to smooth it over, internally. I didn't want to be the kind of partner who nitpicked language or created tension out of nothing. I believed intent mattered more than impact. And I believed his intent wasn't to diminish me. After that moment, there were others, still small, still easy to dismiss. A story was told about me in front of friends that made me sound less competent than I was. A decision was announced instead of discussed. A joke that positioned me as overly cautious, overly emotional, overly simple. Each time I noticed. And each time I chose silence. What made it harder to trust my reaction was how everyone else responded. They laughed, they nodded, they moved on. No one paused. No one looked at me to check whether I was okay. And because nothing stopped, I told myself nothing significant had happened. That's the strange thing about subtle disrespect. It's often socially invisible. It doesn't violate rules. It doesn't cause scenes. It just shifts the balance slightly and then relies on your self doubt to do the rest of the work. I started questioning my own sensitivity. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I'm projecting. Maybe this is just how people talk. I reminded myself that relationships aren't about keeping score, that love requires generosity, that grace is a virtue. So when he interrupted me mid sentence and finished my thought incorrectly, I smiled and let him. When he dismissed a concern by saying I was overthinking again, I laughed along. When my opinion was summarized inaccurately by someone else, I didn't correct it. None of these moments hurt sharply. They accumulated quietly, like tiny cuts that didn't bleed enough to demand care, but never quite healed either. What I didn't realize then was that every time I stayed silent, I was teaching him something. I was teaching him how much space he could take without resistance. How often could I override myself without consequence? How safe it was to assume my agreement. And I was teaching myself something too, that my discomfort was less important than keeping things smooth. That being respected was optional, but being agreeable was essential. The first small cut, didn't change me overnight. It didn't trigger resolve or clarity. It just introduced a faint hesitation where confidence used to be. A moment of checking myself before speaking. A calculation. Is this worth saying? That question became familiar faster than I'd like to admit. Looking back, I understand why that moment mattered. Not because of what he said, but because of what I did next. I chose understanding over clarity, harmony over honesty. I protected the relationship from discomfort without realizing I was leaving myself unprotected. At the time, I thought I was being mature. I didn't yet understand that silence, when repeated often enough, stops being patience and starts becoming permission. Once something happens more than once, it starts to feel less like an incident and more like a pattern. But patterns don't announce themselves. They settle in quietly, disguising themselves as normalcy. By then, the dismissals weren't isolated moments anymore. They were woven into daily interactions so seamlessly that pointing them out would have felt disruptive, almost inappropriate. Conversations developed a rhythm where my role was predictable. I offered input. It was acknowledged briefly, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with a vague yeah, and then replaced by a different conclusion, usually his. If I disagreed, the response wasn't anger, it was patience, the kind that implies you're being indulged. I hear you, he'd say, in a tone that suggested the discussion was already over. Or, let's not get into that right now. There was always a reason to defer, always a reason my perspective could wait. I told myself it was timing, stress, fatigue. Everyone has moments where they aren't at their best. I believe that relationships move in phases, and this was just one of them. Temporary, understandable. So I adapted. I began choosing my words more carefully, trimming my thoughts before they reached my mouth. I learned which topics were welcome and which ones earned a sigh. I learned when to stop speaking mid sentence because I could sense his attention drifting. These adjustments were subtle, almost automatic. They felt like maturity, like emotional intelligence. What I didn't see yet was how often the burden of adjustment fell in one direction. Over time, the way he spoke to me changed in small ways. He corrected me more often, even when I wasn't wrong. He explained things I already understood. He spoke about me instead of to me when others were present. None of it was overtly cruel. It was wrapped in familiarity, in comfort, in the assumption that I wouldn't mind. And because I didn't object, he assumed correctly. Friends and family still saw us as solid. I was praised for my patience, my calm demeanor, my ability to handle things. If I hinted at discomfort, it was often met with well meaning minimization. That's just how he is. He doesn't mean anything by it. At least he's consistent. So I stopped hinting. Inside, I rationalized constantly. This isn't disrespect. This is just a communication difference. I'm more sensitive than he is. I don't need validation to know my worth. Those thoughts became a script I repeated whenever something felt off. And repetition makes beliefs feel true. The most dangerous part was how reasonable it all seemed. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is unacceptable. Instead, there were dozens of moments where I chose understanding over self advocacy. And slowly, that choice stopped feeling like a choice at all. I noticed changes in myself before I noticed the full extent of the pattern. I spoke less in group settings. I deferred more quickly. I felt a brief spike of anxiety before sharing opinions that used to come easily. I told myself I was just becoming more selective, more thoughtful. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. I was learning not to expect respect. What made it even easier to normalize was the absence of malice. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He wasn't intentionally undermining me. He was simply comfortable, comfortable assuming, comfortable leading, comfortable letting my silence fill in the gaps. And I was comfortable letting him. I didn't yet see how dangerous comfort can be when it's built on imbalance. How easily love can coexist with disregard. How quickly being easy to be with can turn into being easy to overlook. By the time I started to feel a quiet resentment, one I immediately dismissed as unfair, the dynamic was already well established. Disrespect had become routine, predictable, almost boring. And anything that feels routine stops triggering alarms. I told myself this was what a long-term partnership looked like. Less romance, less validation, more practicality. I told myself that wanting more was naive. I told myself I was lucky. What I didn't tell myself, what I wasn't ready to face yet, was that something essential was being negotiated away without my conscious consent. Not in one moment, but every day. Roles don't arrive with contracts. No one sits you down and explains what's expected of you. They form slowly, through repetition, through what's rewarded and what's ignored, through what causes friction and what keeps things smooth. By the time you realize you're playing one, it already feels too late to refuse. Mine was clear, even if it was never named. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the person who would adapt so others didn't have to. If there was tension, I was expected to absorb it. If there was uncertainty, I was expected to wait. If something needed to be done quietly and correctly, it somehow became mine. And because I did those things well, the role solidified. In conversations, my job was to listen, to agree, or at least not disagree too strongly. When I raised concerns, they were treated as emotional reactions rather than informed perspectives. When I offered solutions, they were acknowledged but rarely adopted. Over time, I noticed that my value in the relationship is increasingly tied to how little inconvenience I created. I wasn't expected to lead. I was expected to support. And support in this context meant flexibility without visibility. What made the role difficult to challenge was how socially acceptable it was. People admire the easy partner, the one who doesn't demand much, the one who keeps things running without complaint. I received praise for my patience, my understanding, my ability to go with the flow. Those compliments acted like soft restraints. They made resistance feel like ingratitude. So when plans were made without my input, I adjusted. When my schedule was treated as secondary, I rearranged it. When my preferences were overridden, I told myself they weren't that important anyway. I didn't realize at first how often my needs were being reframed as optional, not denied, just postponed indefinitely. We'll talk about it later. Now's not a good time. Let's not complicate things. There was always a reason why my turn could wait. And because I waited without protest, my waiting became expected. The role extended beyond my marriage. Friends began to assume I'd be fine with whatever was decided. Family members leaned on me for emotional labor without asking how much I had to give. I became the person people trusted to handle discomfort because I rarely let mine show. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being perceived as strong all the time, not admired strength, utilitarian strength, the kind that's convenient for everyone else. I told myself this was adulthood, that someone had to be grounded. Not everyone could be expressive or demanding. I believed that my role mattered because it kept things stable. I believed stability was the highest contribution I could make. But stability, when it only flows in one direction, isn't balance, it's containment. What I didn't understand yet was how much that role was costing me internally. How often I was editing myself before speaking. How rarely I felt fully present in decisions that affected my own life. How easily my silence was interpreted as consent. I began to feel like a background figure in my own story. Not absent, just peripheral. Useful, but not central. Included, but not essential. And still, I didn't confront it. Confrontation would have required me to step out of the role, to risk being seen as difficult, to disrupt the comfort others had grown accustomed to. So I stayed where I was. What finally unsettled me wasn't a single act of disrespect, but the realization that if I continued this way, nothing would ever change. Not because anyone was intentionally harming me, but because everyone was benefiting from who I'd learned to be, including the person I was married to. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no dramatic realization, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a setting so familiar it almost feels irrelevant now. I was sitting alone, reviewing something mundane, paperwork, schedules, details that had become part of my routine. It wasn't the task itself that mattered. It was quiet. The absence of anyone needing anything from me for once. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced fully formed, without emotion attached to it. I don't think I'm respected here. No, I feel unappreciated. No, I wish things were different. Just that simple neutral observation. Clear, unarguable, almost calm. I didn't feel hurt when I realized it. I felt precise, as if I had finally named something I'd been circling for years without landing on. The clarity startled me more than anger ever could have. I replayed recent interactions in my mind, not to accuse, but to observe. The tone used when disagreeing with me, the way decisions were communicated, the expectation that I would adjust, absorb, and accommodate. Seen together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. And for the first time, I stopped asking why. I didn't analyze his intentions. I didn't search for context. I didn't look for explanations that would soften the conclusion. I simply acknowledged what was present. Respect had become conditional, offered when I was useful, withdrawn when I wasn't. That realization didn't come with a plan. It didn't tell me what to do next. It just altered something internal, like a switch flipping quietly into a new position. Up until that moment, I had been trying, consciously or not, to earn something that should have been inherent. And once I saw that clearly, the effort became impossible to sustain. I noticed the shift almost immediately in small ways. I stopped volunteering explanations. I stopped filling silences. When he dismissed a comment, I didn't rush to reframe it more acceptably. I didn't argue either. I simply noted it. My silence changed quality. It was no longer reactive or self protective, it was observant. That day marked the end of a particular illusion, the belief that if I just communicated better, or waited longer, or adjusted more, respect would naturally return. I understood then that nothing external needed to change for the dynamic to continue exactly as it was. It was functioning efficiently, just not in my favor. What surprised me was the absence of urgency. I didn't feel compelled to confront him immediately. I didn't feel the need to announce my realization. There was no dramatic internal speech about boundaries or ultimatums. Instead, there was patience, a deliberate one. I began to watch more carefully, to listen not just to what was said, but to what was assumed, to note how often my compliance was treated as agreement, how often my presence was taken for granted, how rarely my absence, emotional or otherwise, was noticed. That day didn't change my behavior outwardly in ways anyone could see. I still handled what needed handling. I still spoke when appropriate. But internally, I stopped investing in being understood by someone who wasn't trying to understand me. The shift was subtle, but decisive. Like stepping back half a pace and seeing the entire structure instead of just my place within it. I didn't yet know what I would do with that clarity. I only knew that I would not unsee it, and that continuing as before was no longer an option. Not because I was angry, but because I was awake. That was the day something shifted. Not in him, in me. After that day, my silence was no longer automatic. It became intentional. Before, I stayed quiet because I didn't want conflict, or because I assumed my thoughts wouldn't matter enough to change anything. Now, I stayed quiet for a different reason. I wanted to see clearly. I wanted to understand the full shape of the dynamic without interfering with it. When I stopped cushioning my words, something interesting happened. No one noticed. Conversations continued as they always had. Decisions were still made efficiently. My absence from certain discussions didn't register as a loss. If anything, things moved faster. That observation was sobering. I realized how little resistance the system required to function exactly as it was designed. My participation had never been essential, only convenient. The moment I stopped smoothing transitions and anticipating needs, the imbalance became more visible to me, even if it remained invisible to others. I didn't withdraw out of spite. I withdrew my effort. I answered questions directly instead of elaborating. I stopped reminding. I stopped correcting small inaccuracies about me when they didn't matter strategically. I let assumptions stand. People often mistake reduced engagement for weakness. They assume silence means acquiescence, or worse, confusion. My spouse seemed to interpret it that way. He filled the space easily, spoke more, decided more, took my quiet as confirmation that everything was fine. I didn't correct that assumption. What he didn't see was that I was no longer trying to be included. I was observing patterns, timelines, and behaviors. I was noticing what happened when I didn't intervene. Who picked up what slack? Which responsibilities were truly shared? and which had only ever appeared that way because I carried them quietly. My silence gave me data. I began to see how often my emotional labor had masked problems. How many small conflicts never surfaced because I absorbed them first? How often I had been the buffer between him and consequences, social, logistical, emotional. Without that buffer, things didn't fall apart. They just shifted slightly. Responsibilities are redistributed unevenly. Tensions surfaced elsewhere, and still, no one connected those changes to my withdrawal. That, too, was information. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't make declarations about self respect. Those would have been performances, easily dismissed or negotiated. Instead, I let my behavior speak by changing what I offered, not what I demanded. I spoke when I had something essential to say. I stayed silent when I didn't. I stopped explaining my reasoning unless asked directly. And when asked, I answered plainly without apology. The calm that settled over me was unexpected. Not relief exactly, but focus. I no longer spent energy managing perceptions or anticipating reactions. I conserved it. Others mistook that conversation for disengagement, for emotional distance. Some even interpreted it as passivity. But passivity is unconscious. This was deliberate. I was no longer trying to correct the dynamic. I was documenting it, internally at first, then in more tangible ways. I paid attention to timelines, to decisions, to see how resources were allocated, to how credit and blame were distributed. Silence, when chosen consciously, has weight. It creates space. And in that space, people reveal what they truly expect of you. What they revealed, without realizing it, was how comfortable they were with my diminished presence, as long as the structure still held. That was the moment I understood something fundamental. If I wanted respect, I wouldn't regain it by asking. And if I wanted clarity, I wouldn't find it by confronting too soon. So I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was finally listening. While my silence was being misread as compliance, something else was happening entirely. I began preparing, not dramatically, not urgently, and not in a way anyone around me could see. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like attention, like restraint, like taking notes without writing anything down. I started by observing my own habits. How often I stepped in to fix things before they became problems. How much institutional knowledge I carried about finances, schedules, social obligations, long term plans. I realized that much of what felt like shared life management existed almost entirely in my head. I had been the archivist. So I stopped being one. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't withhold critical information. I simply let processes exist without my constant optimization. If someone forgot something minor, I didn't rush to remind them. If a plan lacked detail, I didn't supply it automatically. I let gaps remain visible. At the same time, I began quietly educating myself, not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility to myself. I reviewed documents I had previously trusted others to manage. I refamiliarized myself with accounts, agreements, and timelines. I noticed where my name appeared and where it didn't. There's a particular clarity that comes from understanding systems you've been living inside without fully seeing. Once I started looking, patterns emerged quickly. Not wrongdoing, not betrayal, just an imbalance. Assumptions that favored convenience over fairness. Structures built on my continued accommodation. I also started documenting, not emotionally but factually, dates, decisions, patterns of communication, not to build a case against anyone, but to ground myself in reality. Memory can be softened by affection, records cannot. What no one noticed was how much quieter I became socially as well. I declined conversations that revolved around managing other people's feelings. I stopped volunteering for emotional labor that wasn't reciprocal. I conserved my energy carefully, directing it inward. People interpreted this as me being busy, or tired, or simply in my own head. No one asked if I was okay in a way that required an honest answer, and I didn't offer one. I learned something important during this period. When you stop performing your role, people don't immediately ask why. They first wait to see if you'll resume it on your own. I didn't. I noticed how often respect had been confused with familiarity, how easily assumptions replaced communication, how rarely my consent had been explicitly sought. These realizations didn't make me angry, they made me methodical. I read, I learned, I sought information privately without dramatizing my curiosity. I asked neutral questions when necessary, the kind that don't raise alarms. I positioned myself to understand options, not to announce intentions. All the while, life on the surface remained unchanged. Meals were shared, conversations happened, routines continued. That was the camouflage. What they never noticed was that I had stopped anchoring my identity to being chosen or approved of. I stopped needing to be perceived as agreeable. I was becoming self referenced. That shift is invisible from the outside. There's no announcement, no new attitude, just a quiet reorientation of loyalty from the relationship as it was to myself as I actually was. By the time anyone sensed distance, it was already too late to trace its origin. The groundwork had been laid patiently, without secrecy, without deception, just without explanation. What they never noticed was that while they assumed I would always be there, always adjust, always absorb, I was learning how not to need that assumption at all. And once you stop needing it, everything changes. The reveal didn't arrive with shock. There was no rush of adrenaline, no moment where I had to sit down and steady myself. It came quietly, the way truth often does when you're finally prepared to receive it. I was reviewing information I had once trusted implicitly, documents, records, timelines that I had previously skimmed or delegated without question. This time, I read carefully, slowly, not looking for betrayal, just clarity. And what became clear wasn't malicious intent. It was leverage, not the dramatic kind people imagine, not secrets or scandals, just positioning, structural advantage, an understanding of how things were arranged and who they ultimately favored. I saw how many systems depended on my continued cooperation, how much of the household's stability relied on my invisible management, how many decisions had been made under the assumption that I would adapt indefinitely. The reveal wasn't about what was hidden from me, it was about what had been quietly resting on me the entire time. I understood then that my value had never been questioned, only contained. That distinction mattered. I realized how easily my participation could be mistaken for consent, how my calm demeanor had been interpreted as alignment, how the absence of resistance had allowed imbalance to solidify into a norm. And I also realized something else. I had options, not impulsive ones, not explosive ones, but real grounded alternatives that didn't require anyone else's permission to consider. Paths that didn't depend on being understood or validated first. There was no celebration in that realization, no sense of victory, just a sober clarity, like standing at a crossroads you didn't know existed until now. I didn't confront him. I didn't test the knowledge by hinting or provoking. I didn't need to. The power of understanding is that it doesn't require performance. It simply changes how you move. I began adjusting internally, reframing decisions through a different lens. What serves me long term? What am I actually responsible for? What would change if I stopped compensating for imbalance? These weren't emotional questions. They were practical ones, and the answers came easily once I stopped filtering them through loyalty alone. What struck me most was how little anyone noticed my internal recalibration. From the outside, I was still calm, still composed, still reliable enough. But internally, I was no longer operating from obligation. I was operating from choice. That shift is subtle, but it's decisive. I didn't feel superior. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded, anchored in reality rather than hope. And that grounding made me patient in a way I had never been before. Because once you see clearly, there's no urgency to act loudly. The private reveal wasn't about uncovering wrongdoing, it was about uncovering agency, about recognizing that respect withheld does not obligate endurance, and that silence, when paired with clarity, becomes preparation. I closed the documents. I went on with my day. Nothing outwardly changed. But internally, the story had already moved forward. Once you see your options clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of choice. I didn't rush toward a conclusion. I sat with the knowledge longer than most people would have expected. Not out of fear, but out of respect for myself, for the gravity of change, for the life that had been built, even if it no longer fit. I mapped the possibilities quietly. I could speak up, name the pattern, ask for change, request respect in explicit terms. I knew how that conversation would go. I had rehearsed versions of it in my head for years. There would be surprise, defensiveness, promises to do better. A temporary shift. Attention is motivated by alarm rather than understanding. And eventually, a slow return to baseline. I could stay and adapt further, redefine my expectations downward, accept partial regard as the cost of stability. Many people choose this path. It's survivable. It's even comfortable in a numb sort of way. But once you see the trade being made, you can't pretend it's free. Or I could choose the option that required the least explanation and the most resolution, the irreversible one. What made the decision difficult wasn't logistics, it was identity. I had spent so long being the steady one, the reasonable one, the person who held things together. Choosing myself meant stepping out of a role that had defined me in the eyes of others, and, to some extent, in my own. I asked myself hard questions without drama. If nothing changed, could I live like this another 10 years? If things improved temporarily, would that be enough? If I left quietly, would I regret not fighting harder or regret staying despite knowing better? The answers didn't come all at once. They arrived consistently. What finally tipped the balance wasn't anger or resentment. There was clarity about respect. I understood then that respect requested under threat of loss is not the same as respect freely given. And I no longer wanted to teach someone how to value me. I also understood something else, equally important. Explaining myself would not create the understanding I needed. It would only create negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating my dignity anymore. The decision, once made, felt calm, heavy, but calm, like setting something down after carrying it for too long and realizing how tired your arms actually were. I didn't announce it. I didn't signal a shift. I didn't change my demeanor. Outwardly, life continued as before. Inwardly, I had crossed a line I would not step back over. From that point on, everything I did was aligned with the choice I had already made. Not hurried, not secretive, just deliberate. The decision point wasn't a moment of action, it was a moment of commitment to myself, to reality, and to a future that didn't require me to be diminished in order to be loved. Once that commitment was made, the rest was simply execution. After the decision, there was no dramatic shift in my behavior. That was intentional. Decisions don't need witnesses to be real. They need follow through. I moved carefully, not because I was afraid, but because precision mattered. I took actions that looked ordinary from the outside. Updating information, organizing records, reconfirming timelines, things I had done many times before. Just this time, with myself at the center instead of the relationship. I handled practicalities one by one: financial clarity, personal documentation, future logistics, not in a frantic way and not all at once. I treated it like a long-term project, paced and contained. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was announced. I simply stopped assuming permanence. What surprised me most during this period was how little resistance I encountered. No one questioned my focus. No one asked why I was being more self-directed. My competence had always been trusted, as long as it served the existing structure. Redirecting it toward myself didn't raise alarms. That, too, was information. I continued participating in daily life without withdrawal or coldness. I was present, polite, consistent, but I stopped overfunctioning. I let others manage their responsibilities fully, even if they managed them imperfectly. I allowed silence where I once filled it. The absence of my constant smoothing began to create small frictions, missed details, minor inconveniences, nothing catastrophic, just enough to reveal how much invisible labor I had been providing. Still, no one traced it back to me. The system adjusted unevenly. I kept my emotions contained, not suppressed. I allowed myself to feel them privately, without letting them steer my actions. There's a difference between secrecy and discretion. I practiced the latter. What I was building wasn't an escape. It was an exit that didn't require chaos, one that respected my own need for stability, even as it redefined it. Moving in silence gave me control over pace and timing. It allowed me to act from clarity rather than reaction. And it preserved my dignity in a way confrontation never would have. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything was aligning. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They surface gradually. in small disruptions that don't seem connected at first. And because they're quiet, they're often misunderstood. The first signs weren't dramatic, they were logistical. Small things falling slightly out of sync. Tasks that used to resolve themselves now require discussion. Decisions that once felt effortless took longer. There was a subtle increase in friction, nothing severe enough to cause alarm, just enough to be noticeable. I noticed it immediately. He noticed it eventually. At first, the changes were framed as external: stress, bad timing, other people are dropping the ball. There was no acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. The assumption remained that things would smooth out on their own, as they always had. But they didn't, because I wasn't smoothing them anymore. I didn't step in to preempt misunderstandings. I didn't translate emotions. I didn't quietly adjust plans to accommodate preferences that were never voiced as requests. I let cause and effect meet without interference. What followed wasn't anger, it was confusion. Questions were asked casually at first. Did we talk about this? I thought you were handling that. When did this change? Each question carried an assumption that the previous system was still in place, just temporarily disrupted. I answered honestly, but briefly. No defensiveness, no explanation beyond what was necessary. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was allowing reality to be felt. As the pattern continued, the confusion deepened. The ease he was accustomed to began to erode. Decisions now required effort. Responsibilities no longer disappeared into my quiet efficiency. He began to experience the weight of things I had been carrying without comment. And still, he didn't understand why. That's the strange thing about invisible labor. When it stops, people feel the absence without recognizing the source. There was a subtle shift in how he looked at me. Not suspicion, not fear, but uncertainty. As if he were recalibrating a map that no longer matched the terrain. I remained calm, present, unchanged in demeanor. The contrast unsettled him more than anger ever could have. Friends and family noticed changes too, though they struggled to articulate them. I was different, they said, quieter, more contained. Some assumed I was tired. Others thought I was simply going through a phase. No one guessed the truth. The consequences weren't punitive. They weren't orchestrated. They were the natural result of removing an unacknowledged support. And as those consequences accumulated, something else happened. My internal state stabilized. I no longer felt drained at the end of the day. I slept better. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I should have said differently. I wasn't waiting for recognition. I wasn't watching for regret. I was watching alignment between what I knew and how I lived. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as a revelation. By the time the concern became visible, the window for fixing things had already closed. It didn't happen in one conversation. It unfolded over several moments where his confusion shifted into something closer to alarm. He began asking more questions, not accusatory ones, uncertain ones. Are you upset about something? Did I do something wrong? You've been different lately. They were questions I had once hoped he'd ask years earlier. I answered them calmly, honestly, but without depth. I wasn't withholding out of cruelty. I simply knew that explanation now would be misinterpreted as an opening for negotiation. And I was no longer negotiating. He tried in small ways to restore the familiar rhythm, increased attentiveness, brief check ins, occasional gestures that suggested effort. They weren't insincere, but they were reactive, motivated by discomfort rather than understanding. I could see him reaching for the version of me he was used to, the one who would reassure him, explain herself, smooth the tension so things could return to normal. That version didn't reappear, not because I was punishing him, but because she no longer existed. The imbalance had been tolerated for too long to be corrected by late stage awareness. Respect offered only after withdrawal is felt doesn't repair what was eroded over time. It highlights the delay. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when I realized he believed we were still in the fixing phase, that with enough effort, things could revert. That realization made me sad, not angry, because I understood then how differently we had experienced the same relationship. For him, this was a sudden disruption. For me, it was the final step in a long process of recognition. He was responding to loss. I was acting from clarity. Regret surfaced in subtle ways. Not apologies exactly, but references to the past. We used to be so good at this. You were always so understanding. I don't know why this feels so hard now. Those statements revealed more than they intended. They spoke to comfort, not connection, to reliance, not reciprocity. I didn't argue. I didn't contradict his version of events. There was no need. I wasn't trying to convince him of my reality. I was already living it. By then, the decision I had made was integrated. It wasn't something I revisited daily. It simply informed my actions. And because of that, there was no emotional volatility to respond to, no opening for dramatic repair. The truth is, some things can only be fixed while both people still believe they are worth fixing. Once one person has quietly accepted that they are not being respected, the work shifts from repair to release. By the time he noticed the distance, it was already structural, not emotional, not impulsive. Structural changes don't reverse with promises. It was too late to fix it, not because he didn't care, but because care arrived after awareness had already done its work. And awareness, once settled, doesn't ask permission to move forward. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no dramatic setting, no list of grievances delivered with shaking hands. It took place during an ordinary moment, in a familiar space, with the calm that comes when decisions have already been made. He asked me, directly this time, if something was wrong between us. I paused before answering, not to calculate, not to soften the truth, but to make sure I spoke from clarity rather than accumulation. Then I said yes, simply, without emphasis. That alone changed the tone of the room. He expected details, a timeline, specific moments he could respond to, correct, and explain. What he didn't expect was my restraint. I didn't recount incidents. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't frame myself as wounded. I told him that I no longer felt respected in the relationship, that I had felt it for a long time, and that I had adjusted myself in ways that made it possible for the relationship to continue, but not in ways that were sustainable for me. I spoke slowly, carefully, without accusation. He reacted the way many people do when faced with a reality they didn't see coming: surprise, confusion, then a rush to contextualize. He pointed out good intentions, stress, misunderstandings, moments of care I hadn't mentioned. I listened. When he finished, I acknowledged what was true without conceding what wasn't. I didn't argue his intentions. I didn't dispute his memories. I simply said that impact matters, even when harm isn't intended. And that respect isn't something you notice only when it's gone. There was a pause after that. The kind where someone realizes the conversation isn't going where they expected. He asked if we could work on it. I said that I had already worked on it, quietly, for a long time. That was the hardest part for him to understand. That the effort he was just beginning was something I had already completed. That my calm wasn't detachment, it was resolution. I didn't frame it as an ultimatum. I didn't threaten. I didn't ask for change. I told him what I had learned about myself, what I could no longer accept, and what I needed going forward. There was sadness in that conversation, on both sides, but there was no heat, no defensiveness on my part, no need to prove anything. I wasn't seeking validation. I was stating a boundary that had already been crossed. The confrontation ended without closure in the way people usually mean it. No agreement, no dramatic reconciliation. Just a shared understanding that something fundamental had shifted, and that it couldn't be undone by explanation alone. When it was over, I felt steady, not relieved, not triumphant, just steady. Because when you speak from a place that no longer needs approval, your words don't tremble. I'm quieter now, but not in the way people assume. I don't withdraw because I'm unsure. I withdraw because I'm deliberate. I've learned the difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from self trust. One diminishes you, the other protects you. Who I am now is not defined by what I endured, or even by what I chose to leave behind. It's defined by what I no longer negotiate. I no longer explain my value to people who benefit from not seeing it. I no longer overfunction to keep things comfortable at my own expense. I no longer mistake being needed for being respected. That doesn't mean I'm guarded or hardened. I'm still calm, still observant, still capable of deep care. But my care now has direction. It moves toward reciprocity, not obligation. I've learned that respect is not loud. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or constant affirmation. It shows up in pauses, in consultation, in consideration, in the absence of dismissal. And I've learned to notice its absence early. I live with more space now, internally and externally. Space to think before responding. Space to choose my commitments. Space to let discomfort exist without rushing to resolve it for everyone else. The identity shift wasn't about becoming stronger in the way people usually mean. It was about becoming clearer, clear about my limits, clear about my standards, clear about the cost of ignoring either. I don't feel bitterness toward my past. I understand why I stayed quiet for as long as I did. I was doing the best I could with the information and beliefs I had at the time. Compassion for that version of myself is part of what allowed me to move forward without resentment. What changed is that I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. Being calm does not mean being compliant. Being understanding does not require self erasure. And love that asks you to disappear is not love that sustains you. Who I am now is someone who listens to others, yes, but first to herself. someone who notices when respect is present and when it isn't, without needing to dramatize either. I didn't become louder. I became less available to what diminishes me. And that has made all the difference. There's a belief many of us grow up with, especially those who learn early to be accommodating, calm, and capable. The belief is that if you are patient enough, loving enough, and reasonable enough, respect will eventually follow. That if you don't make trouble, you won't lose connection. Endurance is proof of character. What this story taught me is that endurance without mutual regard is not strength. It's a slow trade. Your presence in exchange for peace, your voice in exchange for stability. And the cost of that trade is often invisible until you finally stop paying it. Respect doesn't vanish in dramatic moments. It erodes quietly, in small assumptions left unchallenged, in silences that go unexamined, in roles we accept because they make life easier for everyone else. And once that erosion becomes normal, asking for respect feels disruptive, even selfish. But here's the truth. I had to learn the hard way. Respect that only appears when it's at risk of being lost was never stable to begin with. This story isn't an argument for silence, and it's not an argument for confrontation. It's an argument for awareness, for noticing patterns early, for paying attention to how often you are asked to adapt and how rarely you are consulted, for recognizing when your calm is being used as a convenience rather than honored as a strength. Withdrawing respect isn't about punishment, it's about alignment, about no longer offering something in spaces where it isn't reciprocated, about understanding that access to you, your labor, your care, your presence is not automatic. It's relational. What changed my life wasn't leaving or speaking up or even being seen. It was reclaiming authorship of my own experience. I decided that I would no longer explain away what my intuition had been noticing for years, and trusting that clarity, even when it leads you away from what's familiar, is kinder than staying in a place that requires you to shrink. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You don't have to be dramatic to be decisive. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. And you don't have to wait for permission to stop offering respect where it isn't returned. Sometimes, the most profound shift happens not when you demand to be treated differently, but when you quietly decide you already deserve better. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever stayed silent longer than you should have, believing patience would eventually be rewarded? Share your experience in the comments.